My wife ran away with our life savings to join a healing crystals cult. I tracked her down and uncovered the cult leader's dark secrets. It's strange, really, thinking back to when we first met. There was a time when she'd laugh at my dumb jokes, and we'd stay up late talking about our plans for the future. I can't even remember the last time we laughed together, the last time it felt like she was actually there with me. At first, I thought it was just normal stuff, just part of life together. The inevitable drifting that happens when people grow up, get comfortable, lose some of that shine they had at the beginning. But then her new interests began to spiral out of control. It started with a few little things here and there, the kind of quirks that could have been endearing. She got into yoga, talked a lot about meditation. She took up journaling and was always reading about spiritual well-being and finding inner peace. Okay, sure, everyone goes through phases. I figured it would pass, like when she got into baking that one summer and filled the freezer with way too many muffins. This would just be another one of those short-lived passions. And honestly, I was glad she was trying to find something she enjoyed. She'd spent years saying she wanted to go back to school or find something meaningful, and I wanted to be supportive. But her new passion didn't fade. Instead, it intensified. She started filling the house with crystals and smudge sticks and books about higher vibrations. She called them energy enhancers and would arrange the crystals carefully on each windowsill. They'd catch the light in the mornings, casting rainbows across the walls. I thought it was sweet at first, but every time I asked what all this meant, she'd shrug and say something vague about alignment and being connected to the universe. Okay, I thought. It's a hobby. It's harmless. I told myself this every time I saw a new amethyst or citrine popping up around the house. Then the candles came. She had one in every room, always burning. Lavender, sage, sandalwood. I'd come home after a long day, hoping to kick back with a beer, only to find myself practically choking on the overpowering scent of lavender. She said it was calming, but all I wanted was some fresh air. When I hinted at maybe cutting down on the incense, she'd look at me as if I'd suggested turning off the sun. But I bit my tongue. If it made her happy, why complain? It wasn't long after that the retreat started. The first one was just a weekend. She found some sort of soul rejuvenation camp a few hours away. She was so excited about it, practically buzzing. I didn't get it, but I watched her pack up her crystals, yoga mat, and journals into the trunk of her car. It's just a couple of days, she said, kissing me goodbye. I'll be back feeling refreshed. The next morning, I woke up to an empty house. I assumed she'd gone out for groceries, or maybe to meet one of her new spiritual friends. I went about my day, trying to shake off the argument from the night before, telling myself it'd blow over. But when I checked the bank account that afternoon, it was like a gut punch I wasn't prepared for. Our savings gone. Our credit cards maxed out. Thousands spent on God knows what across God knows where. I scrolled through each transaction in disbelief. Luxury hotels, plane tickets, fees for more retreats, purchases at crystal shops and energy centers. She drained everything we had, leaving me with nothing but a mountain of debt and a sense of betrayal so deep I could hardly breathe. And then I saw it. A note stuck to the fridge. A little yellow sticky note with her familiar handwriting, barely a few words. I need to find myself. Don't try to follow me. In that moment, all the shock, confusion, and heartbreak collapsed into a blinding rage. She had taken everything, our life savings, our future, every ounce of trust I had in her, and left me with a bitter, mocking message to pick up the pieces alone. But I wasn't about to just sit there and let her get away with it. No, I was going to make damn sure she'd never forget what she'd done to me. After discovering my wife's note on the fridge, my mind was in a haze of anger and confusion. But one thing was clear. If she was going to disappear after ruining my life, I wasn't going to let her vanish without consequences. I took a deep breath, forced myself to focus, and decided to start with what little evidence I had, the empty bank account and credit card statements. Sitting at the kitchen table, I sifted through each line on our statement, trying to track down where she'd gone and what she'd spent everything on. It was a depressing read. The records painted a picture of a life I hadn't even known she was living, one that didn't include me, only her and her spiritual guides. I noticed a few recurring places: Arizona, California, some mountain towns in Colorado. Each name on the statement became more painful as I realized how far gone she was. The life we'd built together meant nothing to her if she could just blow it all on trips and retreat fees. One particular transaction stood out, though. Among the charges for soul-cleansing crystals and spiritual enlightenment sessions was a payment to a retreat center named the Sanctuary of Divine Energy, based in Oregon. It was the largest charge by far, and it was listed as a membership fee. My wife hadn't just been attending retreats, she had joined a cult. At first, the thought sounded ridiculous, like something from a movie. But the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. This sanctuary was her new life, her new community. She hadn't been just dabbling in some new age lifestyle. She'd completely uprooted herself to follow these people. And worse, she'd spent everything we had to do it. I started researching the sanctuary online. At first, I couldn't find much. The place seemed intentionally shrouded in mystery. They had no public profiles, no reviews, and the only mention of it was on some obscure message boards where people vaguely mentioned it as a place for spiritual transformation. Eventually, I found an old news article from years back. It briefly referenced the sanctuary in connection with a couple who'd gone bankrupt after joining. Their family had sued the organization, claiming it preyed on vulnerable people and pushed them to give up their savings in the name of purity. I sat back, feeling sick to my stomach. Was this where my wife was? Had she fallen so deeply into this delusion that she'd sacrificed everything we had? I wanted answers, and the only way to get them was to find the sanctuary itself. The next day, I packed a small bag with clothes, snacks, and a notebook. I had one lead: the town in Oregon where the sanctuary supposedly was. I took a week off work, called in a favor from a friend to look after my house, and set out on the long drive, hoping I wasn't making a mistake. Part of me wondered if I was already too late, if she'd gone too far to be saved. But I couldn't turn back now. I needed closure, even if it meant confronting whatever twisted world my wife had fallen into. After hours on the road, I finally reached the small town near the sanctuary. It was an isolated, quiet place, surrounded by dense forests and winding mountain roads. I stopped at a diner on the edge of town to stretch my legs and get some coffee. The place was nearly empty, save for a couple of locals at the counter and the waitress, who gave me a half-hearted smile as I walked in. I approached the counter, ordering a coffee and casually mentioning that I was visiting family in town. They mentioned a place called the Sanctuary of Divine Energy, I added, trying to sound nonchalant. I thought I'd check it out while I was here. The waitress's face stiffened, and she glanced around as if to make sure no one was listening. She leaned in close, lowering her voice. "You don't want to go there," she said flatly. "Those people are, let's just say they keep to themselves, and they don't like outsiders snooping around." I tried to press her for more information, but she shook her head, looking uncomfortable. I thanked her and went back to my seat, nursing my coffee and thinking about what she'd said. She seemed genuinely uneasy, and her reaction only deepened my suspicion that this wasn't just some harmless spiritual center. But if my wife was caught up with these people, I couldn't turn back now. I finished my coffee, left a tip, and decided to head toward the sanctuary. The drive to the sanctuary was eerie. The roads twisted through dense forest, and the farther I went, the less the town felt like a safe haven and more like some distant memory. Eventually, I reached a narrow dirt road, marked only by a small weathered sign that read, "Sanctuary. Members only beyond this point." I parked my car a few yards away, took a deep breath, and started down the path on foot, hoping I could at least get close enough to get a sense of the place. After about 10 minutes of walking, the forest opened up into a clearing, and I finally saw it. The sanctuary was a sprawling complex of low buildings surrounded by tall fences. Everything was painted in soft, earthy tones, with faint smoke rising from some of the chimneys. It looked strangely calm, almost serene, and I could see people milling about, dressed in loose white clothing, like some kind of uniform. I lingered on the edge of the clearing, watching, trying to take in every detail. A couple of guards stood at the main gate, looking relaxed but vigilant, as if they knew they had little to worry about from curious onlookers. I could feel my pulse quicken as I watched. I hadn't prepared for this moment, hadn't thought about what I'd do if I actually found the place. I couldn't just walk in, and I had no idea if my wife was even here. I was about to turn back when a figure caught my eye, a woman with long, dark hair, standing by a small fountain. She was dressed in the same flowing white clothing, looking down at the water as if lost in thought. I squinted, my heart hammering as I realized it was her, my wife. Before I could even think, I moved closer, staying hidden behind the trees, trying to get a better look. It was surreal, seeing her like this, looking so different, so detached from the life we'd shared. I wanted to shout her name, to grab her and pull her back to reality. But something held me back. She looked content, at peace in a way I hadn't seen in years. It was like she belonged here, like she'd truly left her old life behind without a second thought. I forced myself to look away, feeling a surge of anger and heartbreak that left me trembling. She had done this, left me in ruins, thrown away everything we'd built, all for this place. And here she was, looking like she didn't have a single regret. I made my way back to the car, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to just leave her there, let her have this life she'd chosen. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't really free, that she'd fallen under some kind of spell. This place had taken everything from her, from us. If she was truly lost in whatever the sanctuary had promised, I wasn't going to leave her trapped there. After seeing my wife in the sanctuary's courtyard, my mind was a whirlwind of anger and confusion. She looked happy, peaceful even, which was somehow worse than if I'd found her miserable or trapped. This wasn't the woman I knew, the one who laughed at silly movies and loved long road trips. This was someone else entirely, someone who had abandoned everything we shared. I was torn. Part of me wanted to just turn around, get back in my car, and leave her to this bizarre new life she'd chosen. But every time I thought about it, I remembered the life she'd destroyed, the money she'd siphoned away, and the debt that now weighed on my shoulders. I needed answers, closure, something to make sense of the mess she'd left behind. More than anything, I needed to know why she had thrown everything away for this place. I decided I couldn't leave, not yet. I drove back into town and found a small, dusty motel. After checking in, I sat on the bed, trying to calm my thoughts and come up with a plan. I couldn't just walk in and demand to see her. This place was locked down, and the guards didn't look like they'd be keen on outsiders poking around. I needed to be careful, and that meant doing a little more research on the sanctuary. Over the next day, I combed through every article, forum, and online review I could find. Most of it was vague, accounts of people who'd heard rumors or had family members who found peace at the sanctuary. But in the middle of all the praise and mysticism, a few darker stories stood out, buried beneath the surface. Stories of people who'd lost everything. Family members who had vanished after joining, money that was drained from accounts, loved ones who had come back changed. One account in particular struck me. A woman described how her sister had joined the sanctuary a few years back. Like my wife, she'd been searching for something after feeling dissatisfied with her life. But when she returned, she wasn't the same. She'd become distant, detached, and eerily calm, as if her emotions had been wiped clean. Her sister claimed that the sanctuary conditioned people, convincing them to cut ties with anyone who wasn't aligned with their beliefs. She wrote, "If they think you're an outsider, they'll do everything they can to isolate you from your loved ones." That was all the motivation I needed. If my wife was truly under their influence, I couldn't just walk away. I had to try and bring her back, even if she hated me for it. The idea was risky, but if I wanted to get inside, I'd have to blend in, act like I belonged. I'd need to pretend to be a seeker, someone who was also looking for answers. I figured that if I could convince them I was there for the same reasons as everyone else, they might let me in. The next morning, I drove back to the road leading to the sanctuary. At the gate, I was stopped by a guard, a tall man with a serene, almost blank expression. I told him I was seeking spiritual guidance, that I'd heard the sanctuary was a place where people could rediscover themselves. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine, before finally nodding and letting me in. As I walked through the gates, I felt a chill creep up my spine. I was officially on their turf, and I had no idea what I was walking into. Inside, the place was eerily calm, almost unsettlingly so. People moved quietly between buildings, speaking in low tones, dressed in the same flowing white robes I'd seen before. No one looked at me twice as I was led to a building where new members acclimated to the sanctuary. The place was minimalist, devoid of color or any personal touches. It was as if they were stripping everything down to its bare essence, forcing people to leave behind any remnants of the outside world. The leader of the sanctuary, a man named Eli, introduced himself that first day. He was thin, with piercing blue eyes and an unnervingly calm demeanor that made me feel both welcome and completely exposed. He talked slowly, choosing his words carefully, almost hypnotically. As he spoke about cleansing our minds and freeing ourselves from worldly attachments, I saw how someone lost and desperate might fall under his spell. He had a way of making you feel understood, as though he could see right into your soul. Over the next couple of days, I fell into their routine, attending meditation sessions, listening to lectures on purity of spirit, and doing menial chores around the compound. It was bizarre, but I forced myself to play along, not wanting to attract any suspicion. I kept my eyes open, trying to catch a glimpse of my wife, but she was nowhere to be found. Each day that passed felt like a failure, and the longer I stayed, the more I could feel the weight of their influence pressing down on me. It was as if the air itself was thick with something intangible, something that made it harder to hold on to my own thoughts. Eventually, I managed to strike up a conversation with one of the long-term members, a man named David. He was quiet, with a haunted look in his eyes that reminded me of the stories I'd read online. He'd been at the sanctuary for years, claiming it had saved him, but as we spoke, I could sense a flicker of doubt beneath his serene exterior. After some careful prodding, I managed to steer the conversation towards family and loved ones. His face tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might shut down, but instead, he gave me a sad, knowing look. "We all had lives before this," he said softly, staring into the distance. "The sanctuary taught us that holding on to the past only hinders our spiritual progress. It's a sacrifice, but one we make willingly." I nodded, pretending to agree, but my stomach churned at the thought. The sanctuary was actively severing people from their pasts, convincing them to abandon their families and lives outside. It was exactly as the stories had described, a place that preyed on the vulnerable, offering them peace at the cost of everything that made them who they were. Later that night, I sneaked out of my assigned quarters and roamed the compound. I needed to find my wife, and I was running out of time. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small building at the edge of the sanctuary, tucked away from the main areas. Inside, I found a series of rooms, each sparsely furnished, with only a bed and a few belongings. I tiptoed down the hallway, peeking into each room until I finally saw her. My wife was sitting cross-legged on the floor, facing away from me. She was wearing the same white robes, her long hair falling over her shoulders. She looked serene, lost in meditation, completely unaware of my presence. I felt a surge of anger and sadness as I watched her, wanting to shout, to demand answers. But I knew I couldn't confront her here, not without risking both of us getting kicked out or worse. I stepped back, closing the door as quietly as I could, my mind racing. She was in deep, completely immersed in whatever reality the sanctuary had built for her. I realized then that getting her to leave wouldn't be as simple as just showing up. She didn't want to be found, didn't want to go back to our life. She was one of them now. As I made my way back to my room, my heart sank with the realization that I'd come all this way, only to find that my wife might be beyond saving. But there was no way I could walk away, not after everything she'd done, and not when I knew this place had trapped her in its clutches. I had to find a way to break through to her, to remind her of the life she'd left behind, even if it meant I had to destroy the sanctuary from the inside. In the days following that brief glimpse of my wife, I felt myself unraveling. I kept to the routine, biding my time, trying to avoid suspicion as I pieced together a plan. I needed to reach her, somehow shake her awake from the twisted reality the sanctuary had convinced her was peace. But every interaction, every conversation with other members, seemed to confirm my worst fears. They were entirely absorbed by the sanctuary, completely under its spell. Even those who'd once been wary or doubtful had fallen in line. Eli, the leader, remained at the center of it all. His teachings, his voice, his presence seemed woven into the air, like a low, ever-present hum that pushed everyone's thoughts in the same direction. Every day, I watched how his influence seeped into the members, molding them, wiping away any hint of individuality or resistance. And I began to realize that if I wanted any hope of getting through to my wife, I'd have to confront him directly. I spent another night lurking around the edges of the compound, and eventually, I found his quarters. The main building was quieter than I'd ever seen it, with most of the members in their rooms, lost in meditation or asleep. The place felt eerie, almost haunted, and I had the creeping sensation that even the walls were watching me. But I pressed forward, slipping past rooms until I reached his door. I didn't bother knocking. I pushed it open, my anger giving me the nerve to step inside. Eli was alone, sitting in a low-lit room surrounded by candles, his expression calm, almost expectant, as if he'd been waiting for me. His face flickered in the candlelight, his eyes shining with that unshakable serenity that both unsettled and infuriated me. "So, you've come to see the truth for yourself," he said softly, not even bothering to stand. There was a hint of amusement in his tone, as if my anger was just a small ripple in the ocean of his control. I ignored his remark and launched into my accusations. I told him everything I'd uncovered, how he'd preyed on vulnerable people, lured them in, and isolated them from their families, twisting their minds until they believed they had nothing else. I told him how he'd destroyed lives, mine included, and how I wasn't leaving without my wife. But Eli just listened, his expression unchanging, letting me burn through my anger. When I finally stopped, he simply tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Your wife was lost, searching for something she couldn't find in the outside world," he said. "All I did was offer her a place where she could be truly free." "Free?" I scoffed. "You've brainwashed her. You've taken her away from everything she loved." Eli's calm never faltered. "People who come here are burdened by the weight of their own lives, by expectations, guilt, disappointment. Here we take those burdens from them, show them how to let go. Your wife isn't imprisoned, she's finally at peace." The way he spoke, so certain, so unwavering, almost shook me, but I forced myself to hold on to my anger, to remember that this wasn't peace. It was manipulation, control disguised as liberation. "You've destroyed families for this peace," I shot back, my voice shaking with anger. "You're nothing but a fraud, a parasite feeding off people's pain." A flicker of something, maybe anger, maybe pity, crossed his face, but he quickly masked it. He stood slowly, his presence suddenly towering over me, and I felt the intensity of his gaze boring into mine. "You may see it that way," he said, his voice steady, "but the truth is, your wife chose this path. She's here because she wanted to be, because she needed to be. You're the one who can't let go." His words stung, but I couldn't let him get inside my head. I steeled myself, taking a step forward. "I'm taking her back," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but each word laced with conviction. "And I'll tear this place down if I have to." Eli's eyes hardened, and for the first time I saw a flicker of fear, or maybe just anger, in his expression. "Leave, before you regret this. You're not the first outsider who's tried to disrupt what we have here. They never succeed." I didn't respond. I turned and walked out, feeling the weight of his gaze on my back as I left. I knew he'd probably have his guards on me before long, but I had one final move left. A plan that had come to me as I'd listened to Eli's twisted philosophy on freedom. The next morning, I slipped away from the compound and drove into town, where I found a small, grimy internet cafe. I logged into every platform I could think of, posting about the sanctuary, sharing every detail of what I'd seen and learned. I even posted on forums and social media pages that specialized in exposing cults and coercive groups. I uploaded the names of everyone involved that I could find, screenshots of the few documents I'd managed to photograph during my stay, anything that could raise questions, make people curious enough to look into the sanctuary. By the time I returned to the sanctuary that evening, I could feel a shift in the air. Whispers circulated among the members, a growing sense of unrest. People were beginning to talk, asking questions, casting glances toward Eli and his inner circle. It was working. My posts were making waves, the rumors taking root. As darkness fell, I slipped back to my wife's room. She was there, once again seated on the floor, her eyes closed. This time, I couldn't just watch her from a distance. I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me, my heart pounding. She opened her eyes slowly, and for a brief moment, she looked like the woman I'd fallen in love with, the woman who'd laughed at my terrible jokes and made us late to every family gathering because she could never pick an outfit. But then her expression changed, hardening into that same detached serenity. It was like she didn't recognize me. I knelt in front of her, grasping her hands. "Please," I whispered, remember us, our life together. This place isn't real. They've filled your head with lies. We can go home. We can start over." Her gaze softened for just a moment, a hint of emotion flickering in her eyes, but then she pulled her hands away. "You don't understand," she said, her voice quiet, calm. "I've found something here that I could never find out there." Desperation clawed at my throat. "They've manipulated you, twisted everything you believe. You have to remember who you are." She shook her head, sadness in her eyes. "Who I was is gone. I've moved past that." I felt a hollow ache settle in my chest as I realized that she was truly lost to me. The woman I'd known, the life we'd shared, it was all gone, erased by this place. I could bring down the sanctuary, expose every dark secret I'd found, but I couldn't bring her back. She had made her choice, and no matter how twisted it seemed, she had embraced it with everything she had. When I left that night, I didn't look back. I knew that the sanctuary would face the scrutiny of the outside world, that Eli's perfect little utopia would start to crumble as the truth spread. But my wife, she would stay, bound to them by whatever twisted promise of peace they'd given her. I drove back to the life she'd left behind, carrying only the memory of who she used to be, and the hollow victory of knowing the sanctuary's days were numbered. As I pulled onto the road away from the sanctuary, I realized that maybe, in the end, Eli was right about one thing. Some things we never really let go of, no matter how hard we try. And as much as I'd wanted to bring her back, I knew that part of me would always be haunted by the woman she had become and the life that had slipped away.